hushed of glee, the last chilled bee clings wearily to the dying aster. The leaves drop faster, and all around, red as disaster, the forest crimsons with tree on tree. A butterfly, the last to die, droops heavily by, weighed down with torpor. The air grows sharper, and the wind in the trees, like some sad harper, sits and sorrows with sigh on sigh. The far crows call, the acorns fall, and over all the autumn raises dun mists and hazes, through which her soul, it seemeth, gazes on ghosts and dreams in carnival. The end is near. The dying year leans low to hear her own heart breaking, and beauty taking her flight, and all her dreams forsaking, her soul bowed down mid the sad and sere. All hushed of glee, the last chill bee clings wearily to the dying aster. The leaves drop faster, and all around, red as disaster, the forest crimsons with tree on tree. A butterfly, the last to die, droops heavily by, weighed down with torpor. The air grows sharper, and the wind in the trees, like some sad harper, sits and sorrows with sigh on sigh. The far crows call, the acorns fall, and over all the autumn raises dun mists and hazes, through which her soul, it seemeth, gazes on ghosts and dreams in carnival. The end is near. The dying year leans low to hear her own heart breaking, and beauty taking her flight, and all her dreams forsaking, her soul bowed down mid the sad and sere.
There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge at Lake Lebarge I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home in the South to roam round the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but in the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell, though he'd often say in his homely way that he'd sooner live in hell. On a Christmas day, we were mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold! Through the parka's fold it stabbed like a driven nail. If our eyes we'd close, then the lashes froze till sometimes we couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. And that very night, as we lay packed tight in our robes beneath the snow, and the dogs were fed, and the stars overhead were dancing heel and toe, he turned to me, and, "Cap," says he, "I'll cash in this trip, I guess. And if I do, I'm asking that you won't refuse my last request." Well, he seemed so low that I couldn't say no. Then he says, with sort of a moan, "It's the cursed cold, and it's got right hold till I'm chilled clean through to the bone. Yet 'tain't being dead, it's my awful dread of the icy grave that pains. So I want you to swear that foul or fair, you'll cremate my last remains." A pal's last need is a thing to heed, so I swore I would not fail. And we started on at the streak of dawn, but God, he looked ghastly pale. He crouched on the sleigh, and he raved all day of his home in Tennessee, and before nightfall, a corpse was all that was left of Sam McGee. There wasn't a breath in that land of death, and I hurried, horror-driven, with a corpse half hid that I couldn't get rid because of a promise given. It was lashed to the sleigh, and it seemed to say, "You may tax your brawn and brains, but you promised true, and it's up to you to cremate my last remains." Now, a promise made is a debt unpaid, and the trail has its own stern code. In the days to come, though my lips were numb, in my heart how I cursed that load. In the long, long night, by the lone firelight, while the huskies round in a ring howled out their woes to the homeless snows. Oh God, how I loathed that thing. And every day that quiet clay seemed to heavy and heavier grow. And on I went, though the dogs were spent and the grub was getting low. The trail was bad, and I felt half mad, but I swore I would not give in. And I'd often sing to the hateful thing, and it hearkened with a grin, till I came to the marge of Lake Lebarge, and a derelict there lay. It was jammed in the ice, but I saw in a trice it was called the Alice May. And I looked at it, and I thought a bit, and I looked at my frozen chum. Then, "Here," said I, with a sudden cry, "is my crematorium." Some planks I tore from the cabin floor, and I lit the boiler fire. Some coal I found that was lying around, and I heaped the fuel higher. The flames just soared, and the furnace roared, such a blaze you seldom see. And I burrowed a hole in the glowing coal, and I stuffed in Sam McGee. Then I made a hike, for I didn't like to hear him sizzle so. And the heavens scowled, and the huskies howled, and the wind began to blow. It was icy cold, but the hot sweat rolled down my cheeks, and I don't know why. And the greasy smoke in an inky cloak went streaking down the sky. I do not know how long in the snow I wrestled with grisly fear, but the stars came out, and they danced about again ere I ventured near. I was sick with dread, but I bravely said, "I'll just take a peep inside. I guess he's cooked, and it's time I looked." Then the door I opened wide, and there sat Sam, looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar. And he wore a smile you could see a mile, and he said, "Please close that door. It's fine in here, but I greatly fear you'll let in the cold and storm. Since I left Plumtree down in Tennessee, it's the first time I've been warm." There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the man who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would let your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge at Lake Lebarge. I cremated Sam McGee.
The Dead Smile by F. Marion Crawford. Sir Hugh Ockram smiled as he sat by the ocean window of his study in the late August afternoon. A curiously yellow cloud obscured the low sun, and the clear summer light turned lurid, as if it had been suddenly poisoned and polluted by the foul vapors of a plague. Sir Hugh's face seemed, at best, to be made of fine parchment drawn skin tight over a wooden mask, in which two sunken eyes peered from far within. The eyes peered from under wrinkled lids, alive and watching like toads in their homes, side by side and exactly alike. But as the light changed, a little yellow glare flashed in each. He smiled, stretching pale lips across discolored teeth, in an expression of profound self-satisfaction, blended with the most unforgiving hatred and contempt for the human dog. Nurse MacDonald, who was 100 years old, said that when Sir Hugh smiled, he saw the faces of two women in hell, two dead women he had betrayed. The smile widened. The hideous disease of which Sir Hugh was dying had touched his brain. His son stood beside him, tall, white, and delicate as an angel in a primitive picture. And though there was deep distress in his violet eyes as he looked at his wife's face, he felt the shadow of that sickening smile stealing across his own lips, parting and drawing them against his will. It was like a bad dream, for he tried not to smile. Smile. Beside him, strangely like him in her wan, angelic beauty, with the same shadowy golden hair, the same sad violet eyes, the same luminous pale face, Evelyn Warburton rested one hand upon his arm as she looked into her uncle's eyes. She could not turn her own away, and she too knew that the deathly smile was hovering on her own lips. "Of course," said Sir Hugh very slowly, still looking out at the trees. "If you have made your mind up to be married, you will marry when I am dead, though there's a very good reason why you had better not." At the last words, his head sank slowly back, and the little glare of his toad eyes disappeared under the swollen lids. Sir Hugh had fallen asleep, as he often did in his illness, even while speaking. Gabriel Oakham drew Evelyn away, and from the study they went out into the dim hall. "It is very lonely here," said Evelyn, taking Gabriel's hand nervously, and speaking as if she dreaded to disturb the silence. "If it were dark, I should be afraid." "Of what? Of me?" Gabriel's sad eyes turned to her. "Oh, no, never of you, but of the old Oakrams. They say they are just under our feet in the north vault, outside the chapel, all in their shrouds, with no coffins, as they used to bury them. As they always will, as they will bury my father and me. They say an Oakram will not lie in a coffin. There is the story of old Sir Vernon, who was beheaded for treason under James II. The family brought his body back from the scaffold in an iron coffin with heavy locks and put it in the north vault. But ever afterwards, whenever the vault was opened to bury another of the family, they found the coffin wide open, the body standing upright against the wall, and the head rolled away in a corner, smiling at it. Of course, I never saw it, and the vault has not been opened for 30 years. None of us have died since then." Nurse MacDonald slept sitting all bent together in a great old leather armchair with wings. Many warm blankets wrapped about her. But outside the closed window there was a face. Violet eyes were looking steadily at the ancient sleeper. It was like the face of Evelyn Warburton, yet the cheeks were thinner than Evelyn's, and as white as a gleam. The eyes stared, and the lips were red with life. They were dead lips painted with new blood. Slowly, Nurse MacDonald's wrinkled eyelids folded back, and she looked straight at the face at the window. "Is it time?" she asked in her little, old, faraway voice. was a low, moaning voice, one that rose suddenly like the scream of storm, when it went from a moan to a wail, from a wail to a howl, and from a howl to the shriek of the tortured dead. He who has heard it before knows, and he can bear witness that the cry of the banshee is an evil cry to hear alone in the deep night. "It is time," said Nurse MacDonald. "I must go to him, for it is the end." The light was soft and clear in the room. Gabriel Ockram stood by his father's bedside, and there knelt Evelyn Warburton. Nurse MacDonald said, "Let me speak to him, for his hour is come." "Speak to him," said Gabriel in a dull voice. "By the wife who bore your son and died heartbroken, tell me the truth." "Neither to you in life, nor to her in eternal death." "Tell me the name of Evelyn Warburton's father, then I will let you die in peace." Evelyn started. She stared at Nurse MacDonald, and then at her uncle. Then something rapped at the window, and she felt her hair rise upon her head. She looked around in spite of herself, and when she saw her own white face looking in at the window, her own eyes staring at her through the glass, wide and fearful, her own hair streaming against the pane, and her own lips dashed with blood, she screamed once and fell straight back into Gabriel's arms. The shriek that answered hers was the fear shriek of a tormented corpse out of which the soul cannot pass for shame of deadly sins. Sir Hugh Ockram sat upright in his deathbed and saw and cried aloud, "Evelyn!" "You have seen the mother as she waits for you, Hugh Ockram. Who was this girl Evelyn's father? What was his name?" For the last time, the dreadful smile came upon the twisted lips. Very slowly, very surely now, the toad eyes glared red, and the parchment face glowed a little in the flickering light. For the last time, words came. "They know it in hell." Then the glowing eyes went out quickly. The yellow face turned waxen pale, and a great shiver ran through the thin body as Hugh Ockram died. But in death, he still smiled, for he knew his secret and kept it still. When the time was come, they took Sir Hugh in his winding sheet on a trestle bier and bore him to the chapel. Gabriel Ockram was not afraid, for he knew. When he went in, alone, he saw the body of Sir Vernon Ockram leaning upright against the stone wall. Its head lay on the ground nearby with the face turned up. The dried leather lips smiled horribly at the dried up corpse, while the iron coffin, lined with black velvet, stood open on the floor. Gabriel took the body in his hands, for it was very light, being quite dried by the air of the vault, and those who peeped in the door saw him lay it in the coffin again. They heard it rustle a little as it touched the sides and the bottom, like a bundle of reeds. He also placed the head upon the shoulders and shut down the lid, which fell to with the snap of its rusty spring. After they laid Sir Hugh beside his father on the tressler bier on which they had brought him, and they went back to the chapel. But when they looked into one another's faces, master and men, they were all smiling with the dead smile of the corpse they had left in the vault. They could not bear to look at one another again until it had faded away. Gabriel Ockram became Sir Gabriel, inheriting the baronetcy with the half-ruined fortune left by his father, and Evelyn Warburton continued to live at Ockram Hall in the south room that had been hers ever since she could remember. So Sir Gabriel took his father's place at the dark old table in the dining room, and Evelyn sat opposite to him until such time as their mourning should be over and they might be married at last. Meanwhile, their lives went on as before. Since Sir Hugh had been a hopeless invalid during the last year of his life, and they had seen him but once a day for a little while, spending most of their time together in a strangely perfect companionship. Once, Evelyn found Sir Gabriel in the chapel alone, standing before the iron door that led down to the place of death, with the key to the door in his hand, but he had not put it in the lock. Evelyn drew him away, shivering, for she had also been driven in waking dreams to see that terrible thing again and to find out whether it had changed since it had been laid there. "I'm going mad," said Gabriel, covering his eyes with his hand as he went with her. "I see it in my sleep. I see it when I'm awake. It draws me to it day and night, and unless I see it, I shall die." "I know," answered Evelyn. "But we must not go there," she cried. "We must not go." One gray winter morning, she went alone to Nurse MacDonald's room in the tower and sat down beside the great leather easy chair, laying her thin white hand upon the withered fingers. "Nurse," she said, "what was it that Uncle Hugh should have told you that night before he died? It must have been an awful secret, and yet, though you asked him, I feel somehow that you know it, and that you know why he used to smile so dreadfully." "I only guess. I shall never know," she answered slowly in her cracked little voice. "But what do you guess? Who am I? Why did you ask who my father was? You know I am Colonel Warburton's daughter, and my mother was Lady Ockram's sister, so that Gabriel and I are cousins. My father was killed in Afghanistan. What secret can there be?" "I do not know. I can only guess." So Evelyn went away and let her sleep, with the cat asleep on the footstool. Downstairs, Sir Gabriel sat straight up as the clock struck, for he had dreamed a fearful dream of horror, and his heart stood still. "I shall go mad," he said to himself, holding his forehead, for he knew that it was true. He knew that he must do the deed he hated and feared, if he could fear anything, or that something would snap at his brain and divide him from the life while he was yet alive. He took the candlestick in his hand and opened the door. He entered the low arched passage, and though the door was shut behind him and fitted tightly in its frame, still a cold breeze blew the flame forward as he walked. In the chapel he stood still, his hand on the little turning stone tablet in the back of the stone altar. On the tablet were engraved the words, "The key to the vault of the most illustrious lords of Ockram." So Gabriel saw that his candlestick was short. There were new ones on the altar with long candlesticks, so he lit one and left his own burning on the floor. He drew the iron door open and pushed it back against the chapel wall so that it should not shut of itself while he was within. And the horrible draught of the sepulchre came out of the depths in his face, foul and dark. As Sir Gabriel looked down, something stirred behind him. As Sir Gabriel looked down, something stirred behind him, softly at first. Then he rose noisily, and Something fell to the stone floor with a dull thud and rolled up to his feet. He started back and saw a withered head lying almost face upward on the pavement, grinning at him. He felt the cold sweat standing on his face, and his heart beat painfully. Yet he bit his lips and bent down, holding the candle in one hand to lift the shroud back from the head of the corpse with the other. He caught his breath as he held it, not yet throwing it back, and not yet looking. While he held his breath, he felt the dead smile twisting his lips. In sudden wrath at his own misery, he tossed the death-stained linen backward and looked at last. But yet the dead thing smiled as it had smiled in life. The ghastly lips were parted and drawn wide and tight upon the wolfish teeth, cursing still and still defying hell to do its worst, defying, cursing, and always and forever smiling alone in the dark. Sir Gabriel opened the sheet where the hands were. The blackened, withered fingers were closed upon something stained and mottled. Shivering from head to foot, but fighting like a man in agony for his life, he tried to take the package from the dead man's hold. But as he pulled at it, the claw-like fingers seemed to close more tightly. When he pulled harder, the shrunken hands and arms rose from the corpse with a horrible look of life following his motion. Then as he wrenched the sealed packet loose at last, the hands fell back into their place, still folded. He set down the candle on the edge of the bier to break the seals from the stout paper. Kneeling on one knee to get a better light, he read what was within, written long ago in Sir Hugh's queer hand. He was no longer afraid. He read how Sir Hugh had written it all down, that it might perchance be a witness of evil and of his hatred. He had written how he had loved Evelyn Warburton, his wife's sister, and how his wife had died of a broken heart with his curse upon her. He wrote how Warburton and he had fought side by side in Afghanistan, and Warburton had fallen, but Ockram had brought his comrade's wife back a full year later, and little Evelyn, her child, had been born in Ockram Hall. And he wrote how he had wearied of the mother, and she had died like her sister with his curse on her. And how Evelyn had been brought up as his niece, and how he had trusted that his son Gabriel and his daughter, innocent and unknowing, might love and marry, and the souls of the women he had betrayed might suffer yet another anguish before eternity was out. And last of all, he hoped that someday, when nothing could be undone, the two might find his writing and live on as man and wife, not daring to tell the truth for their children's sake and the world's word. He had read it all, and then he thanked God aloud that he had found the secret in time. When he finally rose to his feet and looked down at the dead face, it had changed. The smile was gone from it. The jaw had fallen a little, and the tired, dead lips were relaxed. And then there was a breath behind him, and close to him. He turned suddenly. There she stood, all in white, with her shadowy golden hair. She had risen from her bed and followed him noiselessly. When she found him reading, she read over his shoulder. He started violently when he saw her, for his nerves were unstrung. Then he cried out her name in that still place of death. "Evelyn!" "My brother," she answered softly and tenderly, putting out both hands to meet his.
It was the design of Angelo Ricci and Joel Zanuck and Manuel Silva to call on the terrible old man. This old man dwells all alone in a very ancient house on Water Street near the sea, and is reputed to be both exceedingly rich and exceedingly feeble, which forms a situation very attractive to men of the professions of Messrs. Ricci, Zanuck, and Silva, for that profession was nothing less dignified than robbery. The inhabitants of Kingsport say and think many things about the terrible old man, which generally keep him safe from the attention of gentlemen like Mr. Ricci and his colleagues, despite the almost certain fact that he hides a fortune of indefinite magnitude somewhere about his musty and venerable abode. He is, in truth, a very strange person, believed to have been a captain of East India clipper ships in his day, so old that no one can remember when he was young, and so taciturn that few know his real name. Among the gnarled trees in the front yard of his aged and neglected place, he maintains a strange collection of large stones, oddly grouped and painted so that they resemble the idols in some obscure Eastern temple. This collection frightens away most of the small boys who love to taunt the terrible old man about his long white hair and beard, or to break the small painted windows of his dwelling with wicked missiles. But there are other things which frighten the older and more curious folk who sometimes steal up to the house to peer in through the dusty panes. These folks say that on a table in a bare room on the ground floor are many peculiar bottles, in each a small piece of lead suspended pendulum-wise from a string. And they say that the terrible old man talks to these bottles, addressing them by such names as Jack, Scarface, Long Tom, Spanish Joe, Peters, and Mate Ellis, and that whenever he speaks to a bottle, the little lead pendulum within makes certain definite vibrations as if in answer. Those who have watched the tall, lean, terrible old man in these peculiar conversations do not watch him again. But Angelo Ricci and Joe Zanuck and Manuel Silva were not of Kingsport. They were not of New England life, and they knew not of its traditions or histories. And they saw in the terrible old man merely a tottering, almost helpless graybeard, who could not walk without the aid of his knotted cane, and whose thin, weak hands shook pitifully. They were really quite sorry in their way for the lonely, unpopular old fellow whom everybody shunned and at whom all the dogs barked. But business is business, and to a robber whose soul is in his profession, there is a lure and a challenge about a very old and very feeble man who has no account at the bank, but pays for his few necessities at the village store with Spanish gold and silver minted 2 centuries before. Messrs. Ricci, Zanuck, and Silva selected the night of April 11th for their call. Mr. Ricci and Mr. Silva were to interview the poor old gentleman. What's Mr. Zanuck waited for them and their presumable metallic burden with a covered motor car in Ship Street, by the gate in the tall rear wall of their host's grounds. Desire to avoid needless explanations in case of unexpected police intrusions prompted these plans for a quiet and unostentatious departure. As prearranged, the 3 adventurers started out separately in order to prevent any evil-minded suspicion afterwards. Messrs. Ricci and Silva met in Water Street by the old man's front gate, and although they did not like the way the moon shone down upon the painted stones through the budding branches of the gnarled trees, they had more important things to think about than mere idle superstition. They feared it might be unpleasant work making the terrible old man loquacious concerning his hoarded gold and silver, for aged sea captains are notably stubborn and perverse. Still, He was very old, and very feeble, and there were two visitors. Messrs. Risi and Silva were experienced in the art of making unwilling persons voluble, and the screams of a weak and exceptionally venerable man can be easily muffled. So they moved up to the one-lighted window and heard the terrible old man talking childishly to his bottoms with pendulums. They donned their masks and knocked politely at the weather-stained oaken door. Waiting seemed very long to Mr. Zanuck as he fidgeted restlessly in the covered motor car by the terrible old man's back gate in Ship Street. He was more than ordinarily tender-hearted, and he did not like the hideous screams he had heard in the ancient house just after the hour appointed for the deed. Had he not told his colleagues to be as gentle as possible with the pathetic old sea captain? Very nervously he watched that narrow oaken gate and the high and ivy-clad stone wall. Frequently he consulted his watch and wondered at the delay. Had the old man died before revealing where his treasure was hidden, and had a thorough search become necessary? Mr. Zanuck did not like to wait so long in the dark in such a place. Then he sensed a soft tread or tapping on the walk inside the gate, a gentle fumbling at the rusty latch, and then he saw the narrow, heavy door swing inward, and in the pallid glow of the single dim street lamp, he strained his eyes to see what his colleagues had brought out of that sinister house which loomed so close behind. But when he looked, he did not see what he had expected, for his colleagues were not there at all, but only the terrible old man with his yellow eyes, leaning quietly on his knotted cane and smiling hideously.
Nyarlathotep by H.P. Lovecraft. Adapted by Stuart Basil. Nyarlathotep, the Crawling Chaos. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger, a danger widespread and all-embracing. Such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that people went about with pale, worried faces, and whispered warnings and prophecies which none dared consciously repeat or admit to herself that she had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abyss between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world, and perhaps the universe, had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which are unknown. It was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he looked like a pharaoh. People knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. He spoke much of sciences, of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless, yet which swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. People advised one another to see Nyarlathotep, and shuddered. And where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare, Never before had the screams of nightmare been such a public problem. Now the wise men almost wish they could forbid sleep in the small hours. The shrieks of cities might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon as it glimmered on the green waters gliding under bridges and old steeples crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city. The great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. A student had told me of him and of the impelling fascination and allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. The student said they were horrible and impressive beyond my fevered imagination, and I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others saw not. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep, through the stifling heat and up the endless stairs into the choking room. And shadowed on a screen, I saw hooded forms amidst ruins and evil faces peering from beneath fallen monuments. I saw the world battling against darkness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drave us all out, down the dizzying stairs into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. I swore that the city was exactly the same and still alive. And when the electric lights began to fade with the dawn, I laughed at the queer faces we made.
When I drew nigh the nameless city, I knew it was accursed. I was traveling in a parched and terrible valley under the moon, and afar I saw it protruding uncannily above the sands as parts of a corpse may protrude from an ill-made grave. Fear spoke from the age-worn stones of this hoary survivor of the deluge, this great-grandmother of the eldest pyramid, and a viewless aura repelled me, and bade me retreat from antique and sinister secrets that no man should see, and no man else had ever dared to see. Remote in the desert of Araby lies the nameless city, crumbling and inarticulate, its low walls nearly hidden by the sands of uncounted ages. It must have been thus before the first stones of Memphis were laid, and while the bricks of Babylon were yet unbaked. There is no legend so old as to give it a name, or to recall that it was ever alive, but it is told of in whispers around campfires, and muttered about by grandams in the tents of sheiks, so that all the tribes shun it without wholly knowing why. It was of this place that Abdul Hazred, the mad poet, dreamed on the night before he sang his unexplainable couplet. That is not dead, which can eternal lie. And with strange eons, even death may die. I should have known that the Arabs had good reason for shunning the nameless city, the city told of in strange tales, but seen by no living man. Yet I defied them and went into the untrodden waste with my camel. I alone have seen it, and that is why no other face bears such hideous lines of fear as mine. Why no man shivers so horribly when the night wind rattles the windows. When I came upon it in the ghastly stillness of unending sleep, it looked at me, chilly from the rays of a cold moon amidst the desert's heat. And as I returned its look, I forgot my triumph at having found it, and stopped still with my camel to wait for the dawn. For hours I waited, till the east grew gray and the stars faded and the gray turned to rosier light edged with gold. I heard a moaning and saw a storm of sand stirring among the antique stones, though the sky was clear and the vast reaches of the desert still. Then suddenly, above the desert's far rim came the blazing edge of the sun, seen through the tiny sandstorm which was passing away. And in my fevered state, I fancied that from some remote depth there came a crash of musical metal to hail the fiery disk as Memnon hails it from the banks of the Nile. My ears rang, and my imagination seethed as I led my camel slowly across the sand to that unvocal stone place, that place too old for Egypt and Meroe to remember, that place which I alone of living men had seen. In and out amongst the shapeless foundations of houses and palaces I wandered, finding never a carving or inscription to tell of those men, if men they were, who built the city and dwelt therein so long ago. The antiquity of the spot was unwholesome, and I longed to encounter some sign or device to prove that the city was indeed fashioned by mankind. There were certain proportions and dimensions in the ruins which I did not like. I had with me many tools and dug much within the walls of the obliterated edifices, but progress was slow and nothing significant was revealed. When night and the moon returned, I felt the chill wind which brought new fear, so that I did not dare remain in the city. And as I went outside the antique walls to sleep, a small, sighing sandstorm gathered behind me, blowing over the gray stones, though the moon was bright and most of the desert still.